I'm Daniel Bass, manager of the South Asia program at Cornell University.
And I'm Shavin Senavaratner, graduate student in architecture at Cornell and student worker at South Asia program. You're listening to the Next Monsoon podcast, where we examine how art and culture can help us navigate the uncertain future. This podcast is part of a bigger project in the South Asia program at Cornell University. We'll be interviewing scholars from around the world to help us understand how people and artists face climate change.
We'll begin with examining how people through South Asia, from the mountains of Nepal to the beaches of the Maldives, from the deserts of Pakistan to the deltas of Bangladesh, from the tea estates of Sri Lanka to the mega cities of India, are understanding, examining, analyzing, presenting, and living with climate change. Our focus is not the science of climate change, but how individuals and communities are responding to a changing climate through visual arts, cinema, literature, architecture, and other cultural expressions in South Asia. In this episode, we look at how art can help us project a new understanding of climate change and the current crisis.
Iftikhar Dadi is both an artist and art historian. He is the John H. Burris Professor of History of Art and Director of the South Asia program at Cornell University. Earlier this year, he curated a show called Pop South Asia at the Sharjah Art Foundation. He recently published a book on Urdu cinema called Lahore Cinema, Between Realism and Fable. So, welcome, Iftikhar.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
What do you first think of when you hear the word monsoon?
Well, I grew up in Karachi. So Karachi was a city that would sometimes get a lot of rain in the monsoon, and sometimes the monsoons would just pass us by. We would see the clouds going overhead and we would receive no rain. So the monsoon is, of course, a very significant, it's both culturally significant. There's lots of songs and paintings, like Ragmala paintings or songs that celebrate the monsoon. And but it's also significant also for the economy and society and landscape of South Asia.
So then what inspired you to start this project about cultural responses to climate change in South Asia?
One of the things that struck me when I was looking at that is that although I know of, let's say, artistic practitioners who are beginning to work on this topic or engaging with, issues of climate and ecology, and there are also others like anthropologists and architects, but we don't have a robust, sustained conversation between the various individuals and practitioners, and also the kind of disciplinary cross conversations, that are taking place. So one of the scholarly as well as kind of, general concerns of mine in the last few years has been to think about ecology more holistically.
That leads also well into our next question, that you were mentioning how different disciplines, there's like a cross-examination between them, and in a way they produce more of a humanistic view. So it's like more of thinking about cultural responses to climate change and what can they offer differently from scientific analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, the science is very fundamental to, or increasingly sort of, incisive and more nuanced understanding of what's happening. How people kind of, in a sense, are able to or are responding to the transformations that they see or they experience is something that the humanities is actually very good at, at understanding. So I think science and policy is absolutely, a very important aspect of what needs to happen and is happening. But equally important, I would say, is the role of understanding these transformations from a humanities point of view. And by humanities, I mean a broad, discipline that's emerging, which is called environmental humanities, which looks at the relationship between the environment, ecology, and really the humanities at large. So it includes qualitative social science, history, as well as, the more cultural forms like, architecture and art and music.
One interesting thing, you are relatively unique among Cornell faculty for many reasons, but one is you're both a practicing artist and a scholar of art. And so I was wondering, how does your artistic practice kind of inform how you see climate change, and how do you express climate change through your own artistic works?
Thank you. As an artist, I collaborate with my partner Elizabeth Dadi, and we have a practice that we, been collaborating on for couple of decades. So one of the things that I've kind of have gotten to know through my work as an artist is that art making is really better seen as a process, which is that when people who are not artists, they will encounter art when they visit a museum or a gallery and they see finished works of art. Okay, but of course the finished work of art is the end result of a process of trial and error and experimentation and and trying out new possibilities. My understanding of what's happening today is also shaped by the way I work as an artist, which has to do with being engaged in process and also being engaged in thinking about the fashioning of art or the fashioning of society or community, which is a kind of a processual and which should not be thought of in binary terms. That there are kind of, in a sense, multiple processes at work. Some of them will, what we might call, fail. Some of them might succeed and flourish in the future. But all of them, I think, are important to understand. So when we think about climate change and ecology, we should also think not just about, let's say, cookie cutter end solutions, but also think about how both policymakers, scientists, as well as the communities themselves are involved in this kind of in terms of this open-ended, response, which is processual. Okay. What I've seen from a lot of what I read about, ecology and climate change today is that people are looking for easy solutions. I would caution against that. Okay. Yeah. And also the role of individuals, communities should be seen also as being creative and being and having agency, rather than simply being victims, okay, of circumstances whose solutions are only imposed from above.
Have you been exposed to or seen artworks in literature or film that talks about resiliency in the face of climate change?
Yeah, there's a number of examples that can be given, but I think climate change also has to be seen in a deeper historical register. So, for example, one of our participants in our seminar is Sugata Ray, who is an art historian who teaches at Berkeley. And he recently published a book which looks at really how El Nino historically affected devotionalism in North India, and how the reverence for natural forms developed, in relation to that. The popular songs in folk songs and popular songs in South Asia, they really celebrate the Sawan and the Malhar, which is the rainy season, for example. There's Ragmala painting, which is a kind of a miniature painting that thinks about the seasons and their affective and emotional valences. Okay, so these are examples of how basically South Asian societies, and there are many more examples, of course, right? But transformation has also taken place over time. So you have in the 19th century, for example, during the British colonial era, the British built the largest canal system in the world, in the Punjab, which basically converted a lot of pastoral land in between rivers into perennial agricultural land, right? So this was a massive project of not just environmental engineering, but also social engineering, because there were new villages that were created, model villages, new, where people were encouraged to settle. So there were also new social relations and cultural forms that emerged, from that. So one of the goals of this project is also to, as I mentioned, not to be very presentist, but also think about these longer relationships that South Asian individuals and society have had with ecology and climate.
No, it's a good reminder that some things like focus on, say, migration to cities today, but there's been migration going on in urbanization and movement of peoples in South Asia for decades and centuries.
Yeah, since, but having said that, one of the things that characterizes South Asia is the very large domain of informality, right? So, in other words, in South Asia, something like 80 or 90% of, employment, okay, and housing and so on is informal, right? Mm-hmm. So, in one sense, the informal is beyond the purvey of planning, right? In the way that people already what I'm saying is people already live and work in ways that in which they adjust to their circumstances, right? But I think it's important for those of us who study South Asia to also take into account. In other words, if you look at a city and only look at the planned city, you're going to miss out on so much of what's happening on the ground. Or if you look at, if you're studying labor, okay, and if you don't think about informal labor, or if you don't think of informal housing, all sorts of networks that exist that we barely kind of understand. Agency, I want to just flag the idea that people make lives, right? People make lives for themselves and their communities in difficult circumstances, and I think it's kind of both as a scholar and in terms of ethics, it's important to foreground that.
I was wondering how that impacts like the art that they produce and the refined high art world that you circulate in, but then what about the art that's coming out of, what about the informal art?
Yeah, that's very much there as well, right? In the sense that there are, in the sense, where do you draw the line, right? In the sense that if you have, let's say, informal settlement that's made with waste materials, right, with the discarded industrial waste like tin cans and plastic, it's a dangerous thing to say because the accusation against this line of thinking is always to say you are celebrating what is, what ought not to be celebrated. But I don't mean it that way. But what I mean is that people nevertheless make lives, right, based on what they find around them and the new circumstances that they face, right, and it's important for us to also keep that into our focus.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you've done scholarship on both visual art and more recently cinema, and I was wondering how like different art forms differently represent climate change and express like what is happening in South Asia at the moment.
Yeah. If I were to, again hazard a generalization, okay, in terms of the different art forms, I think that you're right that each art form or each, let's say, they are at different places, okay? So, for example, I think some of the architects have actually been thinking about this more, in terms of poetry and literature and writing. There is some work in actually visual arts. It's just beginning. Okay, so if you were to ask me that how many artists, of course, many artists think about the landscape. If you think about watercolor painting and the landscape, then that has a long history.
Yeah.
Okay. But even in miniature painting in South Asia, right, the landscape is a very prominent feature. So, of course, all of these have a long history. But if you were to ask me how many artists today centrally take climate change and ecology as their concern, there are actually not that many, right? But in fact, it's growing. Right. So one of the objectives of this project also is to bring diverse perspectives together. So it also becomes a resource for practitioners, okay, in different fields, and how they think about not just their own discipline, but also how they, how they can get a sense of what other disciplines are doing, and so it kind of it amplifies the cross-disciplinary conversation. That I think is needed for something like what is called a wicked problem of of climate change, which is intertwined in so many ways that you can't just separate, let's say, architecture from from people's, let's say, issues of labor, right?
Okay, yeah.
Or issues of how the economy gets reconfigured, right? So so all of these are in a sense related problems, and I think one of the ways that climate change encourages us to do is to think again in not just in siloed ways, right, in terms of very disciplinary specific ways, but also to think about them in relation to because it's a problem that affects, it cuts across borders, okay, it cuts across all sorts of landscapes. So you, in the introduction, you mentioned that South Asia actually has this very varied landscape, right? It has everything. It has like the highest mountain ranges with snow and mountainous areas. It has It has very fertile, plains. It has deserts. It has plateaus. Okay, so it has coastline. It has it has riverine landscape. So it's in a sense a microcosm, right, of there's so many diverse kind of peoples and landscapes, but all of them are affected in all sorts of ways through this issues of climate change. So I think what the lens of climate change helps us to do is also to, in some sense, think of South Asia not just in ways that are siloed by either area specificity or disciplinary specificity.
I want to ask about the characteristics of South Asian art and how do you think they form a very distinctive definition towards climate change?
There are ways to reread, for example, even historical art, right? Which, as I mentioned, this is what Sugato Ray did in his book on climate change and the art of devotion, where he looks at the rise of devotionalism in North India and thinks about that in relation to climate transformations taking place at that time, which is a new way to think about even historical kind of art, right? And the same goes for example, we can look at when we think about, let's say, colonialism, British colonialism, and the vast kind of power knowledge apparatus that they constructed through kind of mapping and photography and surveys and gazetteers and all these things, right? We can revisit these records in new ways and foreground other. There are other ways to read historical archives also to foreground, the questions that we are interested in, which historians like Sunil Amrit do, for example, right? And then coming into the present, of course, artists deal with, today we are in the era of what is called contemporary art, which is in some sense called post-medium. People are not just adhering to one medium like oil painting, but they are working across, so they work in the moving image, they work in photography, they work in installations, right? And many of them are dealing with, either directly or indirectly. So even if they are dealing with, let's say, the urban environment, right, and the built form, that has a certain way of you can read those works today in relation to climate or ecology in an expanded way, in which the ecology might also include the dense urban environment of the peoples that inhabit it could be concrete buildings, right? In other words, so ecology shouldn't be just thought of as the pristine untouched landscape, but it's also the built environment and the human impact on the built environment. So if you think of artists that way, then you can actually look at a lot of art from the pre-modern era into the modern era into the present, and ask questions about that work, right? So I'll give you an example from my own work, mine and Elizabeth's. It is that we have a series of flowers that we've made, which are made in neon and bulbs, and they are industrially produced, and they are quite large. They are 4 feet across. So when we were making this work, we were not necessarily thinking of, the flowers are national flowers. So they are flowers that nation states, claim as their emblem. Okay. So we started off thinking about this in relation to kind of questions of borders and, identity and so on. But of course, now that, as I look back at this work, I'm also thinking that this work has a certain bearing in which when nation states claim a flower, they also claim a kind of a relationship to the natural world,
Yeah.
So there's a kind of, so that identity also is not just, it's also about a certain kind of about botany and ecology and, right? So, and the drawing of kind of, in a sense, what we might think of as arbitrary borders across a kind of basically a natural world that's continuous, okay? So even in my own work, me and Elizabeth, we can look back at our own work and ask new questions from it, and that would be true of so many artists. Yeah.
So how does the choice of an industrial material or medium like neon affect how you think about that artwork and climate change or how it's presented? Because it would be very different if you had paintings or lithographs or sculptures of these flowers.
Yeah, and of course it goes back to, there's a long history. With colonialism came, also a big interest in botanical illustration and imagery, but even the Mughals were interested in, the Mughal, a lot of Mughal paintings, beautiful paintings are about the flora and fauna and, the animals of, that they found around them. So, but then, of course, there are many artists who continue to kind of engage with this, right? So there are artists like Andy Warhol in the U.S. who made a series of wallpaper which depicts and silk screens that depict like flowers, So in a way, even though of course he's seen as a pop artist working in a very urban environment, one of the things that I think cultural forms attune us to and make us aware is that there is no unmediated relationship to nature, right? That it's mediated. So the form of mediation becomes important, right? And the form of mediation that's available to you is, in other words, this is the, you may you may experience the world through the senses and through the imagination and through various other ways. But then how do you? But to make it available to share with others, right? It has to be made available in a form.
Yeah.
Right. And the form, kind of in a sense, the form in which the, let's say a natural landscape is presented, shapes its meaning, right? So I think one of the ways that cultural responses do is that they make us aware that there is no unmediated relationship to nature. So even if we have folk songs, or if we have a painting, or if we have other artistic forms, or architectural habitations that have been made, these are all in a sense kind of important responses to the environment around them. And I would say that's true also of the urban environment, right? So in urban and industrial forms. So again, I'm not trying to distinguish between, supposedly pure, natural forms and industrial forms. I don't see that distinction necessarily, right? Because it's all part of a continuum in which human beings have related to their environment and made a life for themselves, and that includes industrialization. And what we might consider to be artificial, materials. Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess neon is a naturally occurring gas. I can't remember where it is on the periodic table, but
it's one of those noble gases.
It's a noble gas, so you have some noble artwork. So one question is, have you seen, or are there some examples of South Asian scholars or artists who present a different view of climate change than what is kind of typical in the U.S. and that we could possibly learn from?
Yeah, I think that's part of what this project will hopefully. I think the answer is it's too soon to say, and because this work is just beginning, as I mentioned, in South Asia. But I'm interested in both maneuvers, the new work that's people are doing, but also the rereading of older work, right, through new perspectives. So I think both of them are very exciting, and I think they of course promise us to the conditions that characterize South Asia, as I mentioned, like in the pre-modern artistic forms, you already have a very important relationship to nature, right, with in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Islam, in Bhakti traditions, in folklore, okay, in songs, in paintings, okay, in the depiction of basically mythology, right? So I think that's a very rich world, and we can revisit that world again with these new perspectives. But equally, the artists today who are also working, as I mentioned, with in megacities, addressing questions of informality. So these are important aspects of life in South Asia, and hopefully they also have lessons or parallels that of to experiences that other people are having in other parts of the world. Yeah. So I don't want to necessarily exceptionalize South Asia, but I think one should and be aware of the distinctiveness of of the region, and also the micro, like all the other distinctiveness of the small the sub-regions and places, but then also think about this in comparative registers, with what's happening in Africa or in Latin America or in other parts of the world.
So who do you think then the art itself, like in today's world, when you're talking about climate change, who is the audience for art?
Yeah, I think that's very difficult to say. The question of audience is a very slippery one. And I think it just depends. For example, like feature films or popular films are made for a broad audience, right? But then you also have documentaries, right? You also have... Then, in architecture, if you make a building that's like a public building, then it will have more of an impact than a private residence or something like that, right? But even the private residence may actually be quite innovative in the way it's made and may have lessons. The same goes for artwork, right? That there's some artwork that may be more popular, right? And other artworks that may be more, that may seemingly be more hermetic, but may actually have important lessons, right? So I think it's not always a good idea to only seek the legitimacy of art in relation to how popular it is, okay? Because I mean, or even how legible it is at first glance, because it might be trying out new things that are not necessarily easy for everyone to apprehend and it may lead to failure, it may lead to success, or it may open new doors in the future, right?
Yeah.
And failure is always part of, without failure, there is no success, right? So, okay. So I think, if we are critical of works that, that we think don't engage well with, whatever our priorities are, that's, in other words, the idea of making art is a gambit into doing something new, right? If you weren't doing something new, it wouldn't be art. It would just be design or something, right? It would just be something that you've already done. So when you venture into something new, which is the promise of every artwork, then there is no guarantee of what its efficacy or if its importance will be in the future.
Yeah.
But without that gambit, you're not going to get anything new.
So do you see this next monsoon project as your gambit?
Of
into
course,
something new?
I mean, scholarship, like scholarly work is also kind of a gambit. You want to do something new, right?
Right.
And you hopefully you believe in it and you think it's important, which of course I do in this case. But I must say that it's not just me. It's not just my hobby horse, but in fact, this is a collaborative project. So I want to mention my collaborators, which is that there are 4 of us who are leading the project, which is myself, Sarah Besky, also my colleague at Cornell. She's an anthropologist who works on issues of labor. And then there is Sonal Kullar from the University of Pennsylvania, who's an art historian, who's working more recently on artistic collectives in rural areas in India. And the last collaborator, or the 4th collaborator, is Rupali Gupte, who is involved in a architecture college, which is called the School of Environment and Architecture in Mumbai. And there, the mandate of that institution is to engage very centrally with both the built environment, but with also with the environment. So these are our collaborators, and then we have more than 20, participants. All of them are, emerging or distinguished, voices in their field. So I think it's something that all the participants who are on board are enthusiastic about. So. What I'm hoping is that this sense of, shared kind of, interest and collaboration will be, sustained, throughout this project and hopefully beyond. Okay, we have been doing reading groups online. We have done 2 of them, and very kind of engaged and passionate discussions that took place. And then we are having sessions like this, which are more public focused. We will have a conference in October, which will be open to the public, and we also are hoping to do a publication, which is open access. So our objective is, of course, to make this project and its importance and all the various perspectives that it will, it will amplify to, as widely available as possible, both in the scholarly and the general scholarly communities, not just in the United States, but also in South Asia, right? And also in to the public at large. Okay, one of the things I'll say is that we can do this project. This is a project that actually can't be done in South Asia itself, right? Because there are so many issues with visas and hostile relationships between countries that actually scholars and artists find it very difficult to travel, right? So it's very difficult, for example, for an Indian to come to Pakistan and vice versa, right? So in one of the ways that we can think about, but as I mentioned, climate change doesn't recognize borders, right? I mean, the air quality in Delhi is very the really terrible air quality in Delhi is very similar to Lahore. Okay? and it's and the problems are the same. The problems that cause it are the same. So one of the ways that we also hope to contribute is to bring cross-national perspectives into in ways that would not be possible if this project were to originate within South Asia. So we also hope to add, this is another, let's say, perspective or value that we hope to add, to the ongoing developing conversation on the environmental humanities and in South Asia.
Yeah, and some of the people that you mentioned will be future guests on this podcast as well.
With all of that conversation that we had and all those thoughts in mind, what is one sign of hope that you think about climate change in South Asia?
Well, the signs of hope are many, actually. So, of course, the problems are very devastating, right? As I mentioned the floods recently in Pakistan, which were which were really terrible, and people, they are not. A lot of the crops were destroyed, and of course, the poor, the people without means and the poor feel it the most because they have the least cushion and the ability to even withstand the shocks that that their lives encounter when they're faced with something like this. So this is but of course there's increasing awareness because because even though Pakistan these days is not there are issues with political stability, but I think everyone, even people broadly realize that this is becoming an urgent issue. Right, so that's a sign of hope, right? And the other signs of hope are that more and more, let's say, scholars, but also activists are taking this on, right? So, for example, one of the cities that I'm working on is Karachi, where there is a number of activists who are working on. So I'll give you an example. When Karachi was flooded recently, it turned out that many of the drainage channels had been encroached upon by informal settlements, okay, and had narrowed, okay. So the government's answer was to bulldoze those settlements, right? But a lot of activists then pointed out that you can't just, these people, you can't just bulldoze these people because then in the sense that so the problem of housing, the problem of informal settlements, the problem of planning intersects directly with the question of climate change, right? So what's encouraging is that activists are increasingly being very vocal and about this issue, and actually and there are many more, let's say, avenues we have available. So they make websites, they make documentaries, right? So there's a lot in which so I think in the sense that publics are being increasingly engaged, and that's what I meant, that people also have it's not just the state or the World Bank or IMF that dictates policy. They do, and they do it at a large scale, which really affects people's lives, but then people also have a way to kind of, in a sense, voice their, concerns about how this is transforming their lives.
That's it for today's episode on the Next Monsoon. Next time, we'll be talking to Sarah Besky, with whom we'll have an in-depth conversation on tea and agriculture in West Bengal, India.
We would like to give special thanks to Sam Lubowitz and Angelica Kramer at Cornell's Language Resource Center for their assistance with recording this podcast. Shivin Senavaratna not only co-hosts this podcast, but is also our editor. Funding for the podcast and the entire Next Monsoon project comes from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please follow the South Asia program on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SAP Cornell. You've been listening to music by SAP Administrator Gloria Lemus Chavez and her partner Brandon Kane. Make sure to check out more of their work in the show notes.
The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast do not reflect those of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Cornell's Office of the Vice Provost for International Affairs, or any other official entity of Cornell University.
I'm Daniel Bass.
And I'm Shivin Senavaratna.
Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode for new conversations and stories on the Next Monsoon.